Welcome to Connected Learning TV, a broadcast of Educator Innovator powered by the National Writing Project. This episode is being recorded on March 22nd, 2019, and is part of the 2018-19 Marginal Syllabus project. Marginal Syllabus is a project that convenes and sustains equity conversations in the margins of texts online using the digital annotation tool Hypothesis. I'm Joe Dillon from the Denver Writing Project, and I'm a co-founder of the Marginal Syllabus along with Ramee Clear. I'll be the host of this conversation. We've got a great panel here to discuss this month's reading, which is titled Cultivating Urban Literacies on Chicago's South Side Through a Pedagogy of Spatial Justice. It's written by Andrea Vaughan, Rebecca Woodard, Nathan C. Phillips, and Kara Taylor. We're excited to welcome our authors to the show, as well as Ramee Clear and Bettina Shea. Am I saying that right, Bettina? I'll let you correct me on the pronunciation of your name in a moment, so I apologize. I'd like to start by asking everybody to introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Kara Taylor. I'm currently an assistant professor at IUPUI school. I study writing assessment systems, culturally sustaining writing assessment systems, and literacy instruction. Within this article, I am the 8th grade teacher. I was a grad student at the time who conducted this unit.
I'm Becca Woodard. I am an assistant professor at University of Illinois at Chicago. Is it, sorry y'all, is it picking up my video? Okay, sorry. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago. I study writing. I was also a 7th and 8th grade teacher in New York City before I came over to the university side. I worked with Kara when she was at University of Illinois at Chicago, and I'm just really excited to be here today.
My name is Andrea Vaughan, and I am a doctoral candidate at University of Illinois at Chicago. I worked with Becca and Kara to do some of the observations and research for of this unit, and then later with Nate to write about it. But I'm really excited to be here today.
I'm Nate Phillips. I'm an assistant professor in literacy, language, and culture at the University of Illinois at Chicago. I am excited to be able to talk about this work with our colleagues and feature Kara as a great teacher. And my work is to research literacies and learning across geographies, mostly for adolescents in and out of school, across virtual and physical geographies, and especially attending to space and place, both as content of learning and also the implications of space and place on learning. Really excited to be here. Thanks for the opportunity, Joe and Ramee.
Hey, everybody. I'm the first fan, I guess you could say. Chris Rogers, PhD student at Penn GSC studying literacy, first year. So I'm really exploring. I don't have a thing yet. I'm happy about that. I wonder how long to hold on to that. But excited. I've been reading a lot about spatial justice, particularly the Soulja piece that is mentioned in the article. And I'm happy to see it applied to education. I'm excited to talk to you all about it.
So my name is Bettina Shea, and I am a longtime fan, first-time participant in the webinar. So I've been participating in the Marginal Syllabus pretty consistently this year in the 1819 series. I'm an associate professor at California State University, Long Beach. I teach a lot of the secondary literacy courses there and study disciplinary literacies and critical literacies in the literacy world. And then outside of the literacy world, my work really focuses on teacher professional identity work. And I'm also a former middle school teacher, so I was really excited about the context of this piece and kind of taking the critical literacies framework into looking at space-based literacies.
Again, welcome everyone. My name is Ramee Clear. I'm an assistant professor of learning design and technology at the University of Colorado in Denver. I should also mention that I was a former middle school teacher as well in New York City of all places. So lots of small, lovely connections here. I'm a co-founder and co-facilitator of Marginal Syllabus, along with Joe Dillon and Christina Cantrell and many other lovely colleagues, and it's just great to have everyone in our webinar today.
Yeah, I'd like to echo Ramee's thanks to everyone for joining us today, and to the authors for allowing us to study and think about this piece this month. And so it's so terrific to have such a great panel who are, bring such an interest to this topic. I'd like to start by having the authors explain a little background to this piece, really anything you think our readers might find important or interesting.
Well, I guess I could work on just contextualizing the whole study for you all because it was my classroom. So this unit took place on the south side of Chicago in the urban neighborhood. It, I guess, got students from communities such as Inglewood in Chicago, Great Grand Crossing. So a lot of students in neighborhoods that are often, I guess, forgotten, just for funding, for schooling, just for a lot of things. So this study came about because I was given a scripted curriculum, dun, dun, dun. And within that scripted curriculum, I really, as a grad student, just a teacher in general, wanted to make it as relevant to my students as possible. And just to talk about equity of resources and their access in their neighborhood. What really stemmed this in particular, my students like to eat hot chips. They love them. I love them for breakfast. And it was a school mandate to throw them away. And that was the students' breakfast. And one of the students said, well, how do you suppose we get real breakfast if all we have are corner stores around here? That's not fair. We're eating what we have access to. So we were reading the text Omnivore's Dilemma at the time. So I revamped the whole unit to include aspects of just understanding their neighborhood. I've been working with Nate previously. He came in, did some activities on Groundtruthing. So I changed the whole project, the whole lesson, to maintain the integrity of the academic values, but to also include opportunities for students to talk about where they're from and the implications of access to where they're from within that unit. So my school was predominantly Black. At the time, I taught 7th and 8th graders. At the time, 99% almost of my students were low income free lunch students too. So that's a little about it. I was an 8th grade teacher. That was one of my like 5th year teaching. So I've been doing it for a while. And my course was a literacy social studies split at the time too.
I can hop in here. I think I was just talking to one of my colleagues yesterday in the elementary education program, and she was talking about how part of our work in urban education is anti-induction when teachers go into the field. So instead of inducting you into kind of the systems in place, it's about disrupting those systems. And I think Kara's unit and Kara as a teacher are such good examples of taking a mandated text, but totally re-envisioning what that could look like in a way that really disrupts, helps kids think about systems of oppression and racism and is situated locally in place and space. And that's what was so exciting about this unit. Kara and Andrea and I were part of a team of 8 teachers and researchers, K to 16, who were partnering to study culturally sustaining writing pedagogies. So we were gathering together each month. We were reading texts, much like the Marginal Syllabus project. We were reading, we were talking, we were designing units. We were kind of seeing how they were going and talking about them. And so part of the context of this work, and that's sort of how we got set up together. And then we were also doing research in some of the classrooms. So we were really trying to cultivate a research practice partnership around culturally sustaining pedagogies. Andrea, is there anything you'd want to add in there?
No, the only thing I would add is that we, as this inquiry group was really focused on culturally sustaining pedagogies, that was sort of kind of like the broader umbrella under which we were looking at things. But then in the specific classroom, it's in Kara's classroom, the things that she was doing around food justice and spatial justice then began to emerge as sort of like an example of what culturally sustaining pedagogy might look like in a literacy context. Yeah, but that's, I think, Becky, you explained exactly what we were up to.
And my role really was just to give a name to the great work that Kara was doing. So Andrea and Becca, in kind of analyzing and talking about Kara's work, had started to think about social justice with kind of spatial implications, and came to talk about it. And I pointed us to some literature. Chris mentioned this earlier, Ed Soulja's work on spatial justice. And I think what's really powerful about connecting what Kara was doing already and naming it is the possibilities of a pedagogy of spatial justice. So spatial justice is about the idea that in urban contexts, people should have opportunities and take ownership of the social productions of space. And social geographers like Ed Soulja think about this as we kind of make the spaces where we live. So if we think typically about geographies in space as kind of built or backgrounded or kind of the thing we move through, social geographers push us to think about it as active and created by us. That we, as we move through space, we are making choices about what spaces are and what they become. And if you think about our own lives, the places that we move through and connect with come to have real meaning to us in different kinds of ways. The kind of classic example in social geography is a home, which, depending on our experiences, could be a place that feels haunted or comfortable, can be scary, can be a place we yearn for, etc. So that our connections to spaces have to do with our own social and interactions there. And so Kara's work is the work of spatial justice. She's working with her students to support them in being a part of socially producing the spaces where they live. I think kind of naming it and connecting it up to that literature helps us to think about what a pedagogy might look like. Her work is an example of a pedagogy of spatial justice, and I think gives us a chance to maybe more broadly think about what pedagogies of spatial justice might look like.
Thanks for that, everyone. Is there anything else you'd like to say by way of introducing the piece or setting the background for this discussion?
I can add one more thing. I think that, I guess, the whole motivation for food justice, other than the chips situation, I took that personally because I like chips. But also, I think that I'm a strong believer that your ideas and the way you teach manifest from your own identity as a person. So while I was doing this unit, I was doing a lot of self-exploration, healing in these spaces as my students were when they were talking about it. So another personal connection that drove this was me growing up in a predominantly white neighborhood, being a Black student, and the whole idea of where you're from and perceptions about yourself being created by the neighborhood that you live in. So I walked a lot of the streets with my students, and I'm quite aware, and they're quite aware of perceptions that their neighborhood had on the south side of Chicago because of crime or because of garbage and things like that. So I wanted to incorporate that, and also me and my students' love for hip hop brought in a lot, like the spoken word pieces too for that. But I did want to say that because I do think that your ideas, the way you teach, your understandings of schooling and your goals for it manifest through personal experiences that you've had before.
So are we allowed to jump in to ask some questions yet?
Bettina, I really appreciate that. I think one thing, just very briefly, because I also want to get to the discussion of this piece because I'm really excited. I think the introduction just noted on some really interesting issues in terms of Kara being handed a scripted curriculum and then responding by planning in response to student concerns. And then I also, the authors raised the issue of like anti-induction and teacher preparation. So I think there is some weighty stuff to discuss. And so since I get to delay you for only a moment, I want to give Ramee an opportunity just to say why we're here, what the project's about. And Ramee's always brief, but now he's really going to speed up for you, Bettina.
I really will, because I don't want to, Bettina, this is exactly why we bring folks together, to have readers engage with authors around consequential issues around educational equity. I'll briefly mention that Marginal Syllabus is in its third year of programming. We're an initiative now partnered with the National Writing Project and also the National Council of Teachers of English. We, engaging with authors like Kara and Andrea and Becca and Nate, bring together the authors of equity-oriented educational research and make it publicly accessible so that scholars and educators and practitioners in and outside of school can come together and read and talk about these, again, very important and weighty issues. We do so in an online space. We do so using an online tool called Hypothesis. It's a free annotation tool. And so when we talk about the marginal syllabus, we're talking about engaging with topics and perspectives that may be marginal to the status quo of schooling. We're using an annotation tool where we're literally having conversations in the margins of online texts. And we're engaging educators then in a kind of marginal approach to professional development, one that kind of challenges, in some respects, embraces that anti-induction stance that was mentioned earlier. So I'll leave it there. I'm also going to kind of just hang back and listen and take notes during our webinar today. But Bettina, your show, take it away.
Okay, so I just got really excited when Kara, you started talking about kind of your identity and the way your identity played into kind of the way that you created your classroom. And I think that was really clear within the piece. So one of the things I noticed as you guys were writing the piece is, you know, you were really explicit in kind of positioning yourselves up front. So Kara, as kind of a community member, right? Like as a Black teacher teaching in an almost exclusively Black school, right? With your students. And then what you just talked about, right? Like your like co-love of hot chips, your co-love of, you know, hip hop, right? All of these things that really connected you with the community. And then I thought it was really interesting because Becca and Andrea, you position yourselves clearly in the beginning as white women who are coming in kind of a research role. And so I kind of wonder the ways in which you all feel like that dynamic kind of not only shaped the research you were able to do and the discussions you were having in the group, but also kind of the way that it was framed and positioned in the piece. Because I mean, I can see that like Kara's, you know, classroom was such a rich and important context. And I wonder kind of how you all came to kind of co-create this piece and how that positionality really impacted kind of the way that the piece was framed and discussed and how you think it'll be received as well. So I don't know if you guys have some thoughts on that.
I can jump in first, Kara, if you want. I think part of our inquiry group's process was to really position any of the research as really collaborative, and especially being attentive to kind of racial dynamics, gender dynamics, power dynamics, and like traditional kind of research teacher. And so all the teachers, Kara, right? Wouldn't you say kind of positioned ourselves as teacher researchers and as researcher teachers to kind of blur those kind of boundaries that have often been set. And so I think we engaged in kind of really collaborative analysis. Like Kara is a full partner in the full unit, not just, it wasn't like we just went into Kara's classroom, collected data, and then analyzed it. Kara was like centrally involved in sort of the writing and positioning. I'm gonna let you talk, Kara, because I think your position is more important here.
Well, like, I guess my vision for myself was always like that idea of being a public intellectual. So I love teaching more than anything else in the world. So when I met Becca, and we were doing this project. I'm like, she's my hero for writing, instruction, and assessment. So when I joined this project, it was a collaborative project. We all had stakes in it, for just creating the article, and processing it, each member. So there's not just my piece that came out of this project, it's many others. And I previously had worked with Nate. Like, Nate had came in my classroom and had done a lot of activities about groundtruthing and going in neighborhoods. So a lot of what he's done with me and worked with me, and Becca and Nate, just as professors in general, had a big, heavy part in just my ideologies of teaching. So when I joined the project, I knew right away if we were doing something dealing with geography, that it would be Nate. He's the go-to, and it's only right because a lot of what he's done has really impacted my teaching. And like with Andrea and me and Becca on that project too, we all have been just talking about our ideas of it. The project really was getting together culturally sustaining teachers already. So a lot of the work that we have been doing, we had already been doing, period. It was just, how can we create platforms to give enactments of culturally sustaining pedagogies? Because that's such an abstract idea that we teach in classes that doesn't have many examples out there. Now it's taken up more than before, but it doesn't have a lot of tangible examples. So I think this really offered us an opportunity to show what teachers are doing and show that teachers can be researchers, and then work with researchers to show how these things we read in articles actually look in places that aren't idealistic spaces in which all the students sit down and they all listen and but showing it being done in the places that it actually needs to be done.
Yeah, the only other thing that I would add to that is that, I mean, Kara spoke about this earlier when we were first, starting out the conversation, but that everything about what we do comes from our identities, and that includes teaching and that includes research. And so for us, it was important to foreground that in the piece. Just, something like what we're doing right now, where we're conversing, we can see each other and we can talk about our backgrounds and where we come from. But in something like a research article, we become a lot more invisible. And so it was intentional to sort of make ourselves visible, at least in part, by sort of describing who we are, where we come from, and what affordances and limitations that has to what we're able to see and to say about the context in which we're teaching and researching.
So I have a different question. So I've been reading, I think I just always got like a book near, I don't know. So I'm reading this collection from the Young Chicago authors, and this piece sort of like really, connects that into like a way that like the way these interruptions or reframings of Chicago happens within schools. And one of the I think like Patricia Hill Collins has the sort of like term, the concept, the matrix of domination, and looking at the different sort of like scales in which oppressions take place, like from internalized to interpersonal to more institutional and structural ways. And I'm just thinking of like the food justice work here, and like the ways in which like I think it become more apparent, around like the different practices that, different residents or families have around food consumption. But how do you begin to unveil like the food systems at work and how that plays in with like economy and whatnot? And I just want to add, especially at like a middle school level, of how students took to like that more sort of like systemic level. Because particularly I'm from Chester, it's a Black community as well. And I feel like one of the things that happens in highlighting the sort of like effects of like low quality foods in some respects is like we begin to blame one another. And then it's like, well, look at, what you're buying from the store. And how do we sort of begin to like, I guess, move through that sort of like initial reaction, if that is an initial reaction, to think of more complex ways of in which these like food systems come into being. So I'm interested to learn more about that conversation that happened in the classroom, and particularly around like food at like an interpersonal level, and then how that began to be connected to like these more institutional or structural, food questions.
Kara, I think you are the best to talk to this, but I want to show really quick. Kara would do things like this. I don't know if y'all can see this. She would just show like statistics and graphs kind of showcasing disparities in obesity rates and kind of access to foods. And at first we heard a lot of that sort of like, oh, people are making bad choices kind of thing. And then, so we had a lot of discussions, the three of us, around like how to move from the individual choices or, a family choice to kind of systems of oppression. And Kara had some really cool activities to kind of get kids there. So I want you to hop in. But that's definitely something we noted at the beginning of.
So first, I'd like to say middle schoolers are probably the most critical of equity you've ever met in your life. Like they will, from why you call his name first to like, they are about that life when it comes to those kinds of things. I think that it started off in the classroom with us talking about them, because in middle school especially, it was a common practice in my classroom. They call each other fat, all kinds of stuff, get to roasting each other. Those are things that they do. But when we start doing these activities that create like this metacognitive thinking about oneself and one's positionality, and then me engaging in it with them. So for example, we calculated BMI. Now, I took a leap of faith and put my weight up there, did my BMI too. And then them saying like, okay, so they're saying my teacher is obese. They're saying I'm obese. And then us talking about who determines who's obese and what kind of people do you see on TV? What's this idea of beauty? And is that something that we created for ourselves, or do you think that's inflicted on ourselves? So I did a lot of inquiry-based work, which changed the conversation. So saying things like people are obese, this was a common thing they said. People are considered obese because they don't know how to stop eating. They just need to stop eating. That's what they would say about each other, themselves, their family, their parents. And then I would say, okay, so let's look at what a healthy meal is. So let's look at these healthy meals you say. And now let's look in a 1 mile radius of this school in all directions. Is it possible for someone who doesn't have a car, maybe if they're walking, to get these resources and these things that you are saying, and it be accessible in affordable ways? And once we start going out and mapping the neighborhood, looking at these stores, and the lack thereof, or going to the stores and seeing that foods were expired and tags were changed and things like that, that back up all these readings that we were saying, a lot of the conversation shifted on its own. So I'm not an advocate of trying to teach you and tell you there's systematic inequities. I want you to find out for yourself. Okay, so now we don't have the stores. Who decides what stores go in this neighborhood? Is it you guys, or who is it? And they say the city. Okay, so where does the city get this money from? And then we talk about how these things perpetually occur. And then we went to neighborhoods close by and said, well, why is it that there's a Whole Foods on every corner over here? Who makes these big decisions? And then what implications does that have on the views they have for us as students? So I think that a lot of it did start very personal, like, oh, well, he can't put a fork down, or all kinds of problematic things that they were saying about each other, probably about me when I wasn't there, who knows. But when I started doing those activities, I think that really shifted. I wanted it to be something that they found on their own. And then once they found out on their own, then I start supplementing readings with other news articles and with documentaries and with the book but I wanted it to be something that they came upon themselves, because I think that's the only real way that knowledge becomes valuable, if it's really embedded in your journey of understanding it in the first place.
Kara, I was talking with Nate yesterday about like a cool extension to the unit now could be like situating it in histories of place, right? Thinking, so you did a lot of like contemporary, what's happening right here, but if we thought about more like histories of place, so I was talking about like this book, you know, the Eve Ewing book, Ghosts in the Schoolyard, and how she really historicizes how Bronzeville has been isolated and segregated and all those systems in place. And I think that would be like a cool accompanying text to like draw pieces from if you were to do this again today.
So kind of building off that, Kara, like, so, you know, I mean, I also am familiar with the middle school, like, okay, we see injustice, fight the injustice everywhere. So, you know, this kind of part right before the conclusion where you said, you know, you provided them some counter narratives, and these responses allowed students to position themselves as agentive actors in the complex network of local and global dynamics, contributing to food quality, obesity, and equity in their neighborhoods. And so one of the things that I've been kind of working on with my master's students, we kind of do a similar mapping project, but we look at kind of assets, right? Like not just, I think when we think about counter narratives, right, there's so often this deficit framing, like look at what there's not, look at what we don't have, like, you know, but there's not necessarily this kind of framing of, and what are the assets we actually have in our community, and what are the ways in which we are making the best choices that we can make, and what are these, right? So I'm wondering, like, in terms of now you've got like this agency, right? Like these students are fired up, they like see these systemic inequities and they're wanting to take action. Was there then kind of an advocacy piece? Was there a piece where they're like, okay, and now these are the actions, both individual and systemic, that we want to take next? And then was there kind of attention to, there are these different levels, right? There's individual change and then there's institutional change. You know, so I'm interested in kind of how that played out in terms of the acting part after the kind of intellectualizing part.
So we did an activity very similar. Well, Nate introduced me to this idea of like ground truthing. So like on a map, certain things on a map are valued and certain things are not. So while we were walking in the neighborhood and through their spoken words, they created like very personal appreciations of place for places that mattered to them the most. And that's just an individual thing. Them being fired up, and my students were the type of students who they were like doing petitions, and they do like town halls and things like that, like activism in many different ways other than like, I think a lot of students think protesting means like breaking a window or something like that, and that's not what it is. So they end up talking to the school about it, presenting to other classes. They end up talking to their parents, community stakeholders about the issue. But then we also studied examples of how it's being done on larger scales outside of themselves. So personally, as a class, we made maps of the neighborhood that appreciate aspects of the neighborhood. And individually, they healed from the experience of the trauma attached to these labels that they've been given because of where they live. And then as a school-wide thing, they use that to inform stakeholders, parents, and community members. And then we talked about even larger ways of organizing and working on the idea of justice and food outside of just what we could have done on the school level also. So we studied other examples. We didn't get far from what we did in the school, which I still thought that was really, really great. But that's kind of how it played out. It went from a very personal, reflective, critical work before we could engage in this, where they're healing from things like being called ghetto and words that they threw out because of things like trash in their neighborhoods, or because they don't eat healthy, or being labeled as lazy, or like all these other things that they've been told personally, and then they move for a class. What's our appreciation from this place, and how can we appreciate this place given these inequities of food distribution, food distribution. And then we talk to the school and community stakeholders, the principal, the teachers, the students, the parents too. And then we just studied it on a larger scale to say if we had more time, then we would do it even bigger than what we're doing now.
And I would just add, I do think you saw the students, the youth themselves in their writing sort of doing that work, Bettina, that you're talking about, kind of pushing and saying, but here's the assets of this place. Here's like a line from one of the poems. I think we excerpted it, but we didn't do the whole thing. So part of the poem is like about how things are unfair in the neighborhood, but then the student says, if I said I was from Chirac, where you see kids playing on the swings in the park on a hot summer day, so much silence, you could hear the ice cream truck that has the ice cream that tastes like it comes from a fresh cow. Would you know where I was from? And so I think they do this positioning and repositioning of selves and of place in really powerful ways through their individual writing too.
What's this groundtruthing thing? I'm confused.
I can take that one. Yeah. I think Kara talked about the sort of value that's in maps. So if we sort of typically take a map and think of it as representing truth, that it's telling us what is on the ground. But if you take different kinds of maps, if you take a Google map, if you take a paper map, and you go out on the ground, you see all the things that are not represented and the things that are represented. So ground truthing is about going to the ground and truthing what's there in comparison to what's on the map. There's different ways to think about it. Map makers use it as a way of checking to see if the map is saying the things it should be saying. But it's a way of showing, and students very quickly pick up on this when you do this activity, go into the neighborhood with Google Maps, the things that are meaningful to them that aren't represented. As an example, a high school that we've done this activity at, in front of the school are speed cameras that are kind of clicking all day, and residents who are driving by who live in the neighborhood are having to pay all kinds of money to the city for driving a few miles over the speed limit. If you look on Google Maps, there's no representation of that. Although my wife told me recently, maybe they are moving in that direction, like it warns you about it. But that's one example of the kind of thing that might be meaningful that's not represented. Lots of other examples are, vegetation, trees, the spot that matters to you in terms of like a bench to sit on, etc. So the idea is just going to see for yourself what's in the map and what's on the ground. Does that make sense, Chris?
Yeah, that sounds like a pretty cool project. I'm thinking about it.
Have you written about that, Nate? Sorry, Ramee. I just want to ask, do you have other citations so that we can cite you? Because I would like to read more and learn more. Sorry, sure. Just like shameless plug for yourself here.
Yeah, the person actually probably to cite is Katie Hedrick Taylor. It's my colleague. We went to grad school together. She's at the University of Washington now. If you look her up, you'll find some good ground truthing stuff.
On this similar theme around place, truth, mapping, this article, and Kara, I so appreciate hearing and learning more about your classroom around this teaching experience, is oriented towards a number of specific communities in Chicago. We've mentioned Brownsville, we've mentioned Englewood. If people are perhaps familiar with the city or the school or that area, that might resonate for them. I'm also aware, though, that people will be listening to or watching this webinar who teach in very different places, who may not be familiar with Chicago, who might be in more rural or in suburban areas, who might teach or live in gated communities that are intentionally segregated from other spaces. And I'm wondering how we take this conversation and think about educators who might be interested in notions of place, who might be really curious about this idea of spatial justice, or maybe because of this webinar are hearing about ground truthing for the very first time. And they're thinking, I live in a very different kind of community. I teach in a very different kind of community. My students commute to school in very different kinds of ways. What are maybe some of the questions that they also may be asking? What are some of the entry points that they might consider to do this kind of work? As we think about a kind of pedagogy of spatial justice, how might educators in very different spaces and contexts begin to pick up this work?
Well, I think this in particular is an urban setting, but I also think that place and resources in place are very telling and indicative of how you live your life too. So I still think that even if I lived in a suburb outside of Chicago, talking about what this suburb offers, what it's known for, what these students have access to, and what the implications of this access, what are the implications of this kind of access to resources on their life would be, is still a very good question. And then positioning your community, your suburb, with another place and saying, okay, so this is what is offered and these are the resources, this is what the maps say, this is the truth that I know, and this has these kind of implications on us versus another community that's somewhat different and looking at the same questions. I think that comparative thing is where you start thinking about things like inequities and injustices, rather than just saying like in our neighborhood. It's more of in my neighborhood compared to other places. So even though you might have a Whole Foods or you might have a Meijer or Kroger, it's Kroger's out in Indianapolis now, Kroger's is that the truth for everyone? And if that's not the truth for everyone, then why is it? And what kind of message is that sending because of that? So I think it's more of that comparative thing. I think you could do the exact same thing, all these things, in a different place, but the implications on your life are just different. And because of that, is that the truth everywhere? And if it's not, then what kind of implications does that have? What message is that saying? And who makes these decisions about these things?
I was thinking some similar things, Kara, and I think that's why I brought up the e-viewing book earlier, thinking about histories of space and place and race. I think can be really powerful work in whatever place that you're in. And I think e-viewing does it really well. She really beautifully thinks about a contemporary moment as situated in histories of place. And I think that we could all be encouraged as educators to do that work in our context.
I wanted to just toss in a quote from Soulja. So Soulja talks about spatial justice as fighting for the right to the city, which he takes from Henry Lefebvre, who's another social geographer and spatial theorist. And this is what Soulja says in his book, Seeking Spatial Justice. He says, fighting for the right to the city, seen in this way, as a demand for greater control over how the spaces in which we live are socially produced, wherever we may be located, becomes virtually synonymous with seeking spatial justice. And I think that's the idea, is that wherever you're located, fighting for, demanding for greater control over how the spaces in which we live are socially produced is seeking spatial justice. So I think that concept can be done no matter where it is that we live.
I'd like to jump in just for a moment, like with a note of appreciation for the conversation and also a question. I connected earlier as we were introducing this piece and with Kara talking about how she was handed a scripted curriculum. And then also the idea that all these kids and Kara love to eat these chips and the school had mandated that the chips needed to be thrown away. And I think that there's just this paternalistic thing where a new teacher is handed this scripted curriculum and also charged with this like this power struggle with the students they serve. And first of all, I'm really appreciative of the conversation we're having here, because you clearly took a different path than the scripted curriculum. I don't know how many chips you've thrown away, and I've certainly thrown away, or I've taken away chips from a child with fingers full of hot Cheetos. So, I'm not innocent either. But I appreciate that you took a different path with this work. And I'm also reminded of something I heard Chris say years ago in a different webinar somewhere associated with the National Writing Project, where Chris talked about being a early career teacher and feeling like he was hired to do one thing, and then realizing what the school actually wanted him to do was something he wasn't quite as, game for. So I wonder if you just talk to like the notion of what you were charged to do and maybe your different path a little bit.
So I was given the curriculum. I don't know if I should say this, the curriculum, but I will. It was Engage New York, and a lot of schools use it. It's free too, so a lot of people use it other than the text. For me, and I say this to my education teachers, there's this idea of hacking curriculums in the system. But the only way to disrupt and hack is that you actually need to know content and what's being asked of you. So I got this curriculum. I was told to use it every day. I was told that we'd be tested every quarter. And then we got bi-weekly tests and a yearly test that was solely based on this curriculum. So I did a really deep dive and study of the curriculum. What standards is this curriculum asking for me to know for my students? Because a big part of being culturally relevant and sustaining is that you're not negotiating academic success of students. They still should be coming out and being successful, learning content, but also learning about themselves and interrogating themselves. So I studied the curriculum. I studied the standards. I studied what kinds of things they would need to be able to do, and I framed it in a way that was relevant and that positioned them as activists inside of the world. And I know that that's a daunting and very hard thing to do. And I tell my students in my teacher education classes that all the time. Like, you have to study these standards and know these things, so when you are deviating, you're doing it in meaningful ways, and you have to have a toolkit for this. So I always tell them, like, culturally sustaining and relevant teaching is not that kind of thing where you do it from 8:45 to 3:45. It's like a new lifestyle, almost like you're an activist in every aspect of your being, and you have to study these things and know these things. I think that for me, my advice is, outside of what I did, because I know everybody's like, I'm not going to do that. Probably that's a lot you're saying right now. I tell them text and task are usually your access points for deviating and creating differentiation and scaffolding of these kind of curriculums to make them more relevant. So I either will keep the text and change the task, or keep the task and change the text. So am I choosing critical text? What kind of criticality can I pull from this text? And then task, I would allow them to do some interrogation of themselves and the world around them, but still having this academic value within it. And that is different than what was expected. But oftentimes I do tell teachers, if you know the value of what you're doing and you can explain it in ways that show that you are not just out here teaching about issues with no relation to the job that you actually have, which is to teach students, then oftentimes when you let everyone know and you work with everyone, it's very different. I have conversations with my principal. I talk to parents. I talk to people in the community. And I invited them in on this process and presented it in a very way in which this is academically valuable for our students in this way. This adds to their socio-political consciousness in this way. And they're developing cultural competence in these ways. And all these things can work together. They don't have to be separate things.
I really appreciate it. I'm listening and I'm like, so this feels like it was a very open thing in terms of like remaking the curriculum in this way. And I know sometimes teachers don't have the privilege to being able to do that. Sometimes you got to make things in your. So this project was open, and was there relationships with other classrooms, other subjects, other teachers within the school that helped, spread the energy of like remaking the scripted curriculum in this way and thinking about space, place, and race?
Well, they supported me. I can't say anyone helped me per se. It was a cross-disciplinary unit. So it included science, it included math, social studies, and reading. I'll be honest, often I was one of me too, so I didn't have a teaching partner either. A lot of people supported me, and I let them know what I was doing, but no one helped me. If that's the case, a lot of this is done by yourself, and that's the truth of teaching. Like, not everyone will always be on the same boat as you, but I also tell, especially my teacher education, if you're passionate about something, you stand in your truth for it. I think oftentimes this becomes like a controversial thing when you when you do make changes with no kind of benefit to students academically, but you're also it's almost like they say you're trying to indoctrinate these students without showing them that there is value in hip hop and value in spoken word. There's value in walking your neighborhood. There's outside of just like, yeah, you're growing as a person, but I'm preparing you to be out in the world, like in any kind of essence. Like, you don't need to read Shakespeare to learn about figurative language. You don't have to do these things to learn these things. I didn't have support. I've seen places where people have had support, but I think that usually it starts off by you. And after they saw my unit and the school saw it, then more people came in conversation with me. I was asked to do curriculum design for other places, and then I was able to spread it that way too. And I did free professional developments in that way. I think it usually starts with just you. And then once they see how well it went and the cool things and students are able to talk about it, then I think based on your impact grows that way.
So Kara, that kind of concept of starting with just you and kind of all of these great things that you did and then were kind of able to do both inside your classroom and how it spread. My question, kind of in line with my other hat as a teacher educator, is I know now you're at the university level, so how do we actually help or support our pre-service teachers into developing that type of teacher identity? So one, they have the competence to be able to do what you did and really keep that rigorous academic side high, right? While really drawing from students' assets, drawing from students' communities. How do we not reproduce you, right? Because obviously people are going to draw from their own identities and backgrounds, but how do we support teachers who are going into classrooms, teachers who are in classrooms, to actually become these agents of change, to actually draw from students' communities, and to actually challenge when they're given curriculum in a box, right? How do we actually, can you solve all the problems of education for me as a teacher educator? And then also, can you tell me how we dismantle the system? Go.
I'll try. So first, I'd like to say the Sustain network that Becca generated and invited me into was one space. And that was both academic in the sense of we were all, most of us were PhD students, but we all were teachers. and creating those spaces to talk about what we're doing, how to develop things we're doing, what is culturally sustaining teaching, and having spaces to talk about that work and being critical of our work. That's one way. And I think oftentimes teachers don't get those spaces to talk about those things. And I also think that for my methods classes, I teach it almost how I would teach my eighth grade class. Like, we are going to learn what culturally sustaining pedagogy theoretically is, but I'm going to weave this through all the methods. So my job, I'm hired to be a methods teacher. I have to teach methods, but how can I create text selection in culturally sustaining ways? Okay, so let's talk about critical text. Okay, what's that academic value of this text? And then also, what is the social issue and the form of activism in this text? And I think that creating these kind of opportunities in which my students have to go into these urban neighborhoods and these schools and enact and practice all the things that we're saying, and also be informed about what's going on in the world. Because I think a lot of times, like, a lot of these things go over and these conversations don't happen is because we need to know what's going on, how our students are positioned in the news, what's going on in the community, and there's this not knowing. So, like, I almost think it's our job to force our students to begin to reckon with what's going on around them. So I make my students walk the neighborhood. I make them report on the news and talk to me about the implications of these news on the students, and design units that are about debunking oppression. And they have to do all this work before they hand it to students. So I think that a lot of it is just on, are you combining your beliefs of culturally sustaining pedagogy through all the methods that you're teaching them and giving them authentic ways to enact this kind of work that isn't just idealistic? Because the reality is, a lot of the readings we have say a lot of things, but then when you try it in your room, you're like, now my 32 kids are all sitting down and they're all listening to me. Why isn't this going like the article said it would? So I think given that space, I think Becca could talk more also about just creating spaces like Project Sustain and the benefits of it.
Yeah, thanks, Kara. Bettina, I'm so glad you asked that, because it's something I think about all the time. Like, when you're a critically minded teacher trying to do anti-racist work, it can be really isolating and you can feel kind of all alone. And I feel like I've learned a lot from the National Writing Project and the ways that they set up these networks, long-term networks that maybe are online, maybe in person, and how powerful people have found those to be. We got a little grant to do our inquiry group, and I think that makes a big difference. Like, being able to pay teachers for their time and to have some spaces where we could do the work. But like, that's hard to do. And one thing I've been thinking about how to scale the work or think about the work differently is maybe trying to think about school-based partnerships. So we could be doing work at a whole school with a team of teachers and administrators all engaged in the work collectively, instead of like a teacher here, a teacher here, a teacher here. So like, to me, that's a really exciting direction to sort of think about moving, is like partnering with schools to kind of cultivate, and maybe finding a teacher like Kara at a school who really wants to be a teacher leader. Again, a lot of this is drawing from National Writing Project models of PD, and then really thinking about how to do the work. And I don't know, Kara, like, can you imagine that being, I don't know, we've talked about this a lot, if that's a possibility, if it would really happen. I think the thing you run then is like, it just feels like another thing that people have to do when you already have so many initiatives that you quote unquote have to do. So you really want it to come from the teachers, not feel something that's pushed onto them.
So I'm blessed, I will say, to be at IUPUI. They take a very unique outlook on it. Shout out to IUPUI. But they do these partnerships too. So they have partnerships with the public schools in Indianapolis and IPS. And with those partnerships, they have liaisons who go in the schools and work with the teachers and work with student teachers, and they work with our students, and they host class inside of the schools. Like, and this is something, this wasn't the case when I did my unit, but I just imagine if that was the case for me before. I think that really goes with the idea of like making sure that our universities are really serving what we say we're serving. Like, are we really helping these public schools by going out there and partnering with these teachers and creating these kind of opportunities? Because the only thing that made my unit better was seeing all these cool the units were so great. This is one unit, but if you heard about all the other units that were done, like, and the publications, we'd have publications about them, just showing all the cool things that came out of this space that Becca really helped facilitate. Like, it makes me really think of the idea of what professional development should be. Are we allowing these spaces to interrogate our bias, to interrogate who we are, and then how that surfaces through the way we teach and how we think about teaching too?
So with an eye toward the clock, I want to invite everyone to think about maybe a last thought, and certainly open the floor back up to folks. But anyone want to jump in with a last thought?
I guess I say this work, my advice to teachers, because as a teacher, I'd probably say, okay, what does this have to do with me? I would say that this work takes time, and it's a process, and it's not always as successful as we want it to be right away, but it is really worth it for your students. I think that this idea of culturally sustaining teaching is something that's very abstract and it's unique, and it's not something you could read in a book to say this is how you do it. You might know the qualities of it, but it's really based on your students and who you are as a person, and you're jointly growing with your students for that. I challenge teachers and just researchers who are working with methods courses to create these kind of opportunities just to impact more people too. So as a professor, I think of all these experiences as a teacher, how I could create spaces for my students to really learn and have these shared experiences too, and navigate their way and their flavor and their identity of teaching based on these principles. And as a teacher, the only way I could create change for schooling is to create teaching in these ways in which my students are activists, because they're the real change makers. It has little to do with me. I'm just a facilitator. So I urge everyone to just allow students to find their voice and become activists, because they're the real ones who hold the power in these kind of places.
I wanted to share a final thought that is kind of a little bit in parallel to our discussion, although it's come up in a few spots, and that's the importance of networks and development of these kinds of ideas across people and time. And I'm thinking especially about my own, so the work in Kara's classroom, for example, coming and doing activities is built on histories that have to do with my graduate school training with people that I worked with who were incredibly influential thinkers. People like Kevin Leander was my advisor in my doctoral program, and Rogers Hall, who I worked closely with, and Katie Hedrick Taylor, who I mentioned, and Jasmine Ma, who was another doctoral student with us, that the things that I brought into Kara's classroom have these intellectual histories. And in Kara's classroom, it wasn't just me. We haven't talked about Samiko Washington, who's one of our doctoral students at UIC, who was there in Kara's classroom and contributing to this work and bringing new things to it. And Samiko's doctoral research that she's working on right now kind of takes healing approaches and trauma-informed approaches to the things that we're talking about that don't show up necessarily yet in this work or we haven't talked about. And so I just think those kind of Becca mentioned National Writing Project and models of professional development, like the way that these ideas get built are in conversations like this, and it's really challenging to track those things, how we're learning and how we're connecting and where, you know, our ideas are coming and flowing from and to, not that we need to track them, but I just want to kind of recognize that in this work, that those are really important influences, and that the networking like this conversation is really important. So that's just something I've been thinking about as we've been talking today.
Mine's not so much a concluding thought. I just want to shout out the other members of our bigger team, Rick, Paul, Evan, Dan, Emily. They've just been like so formative to our thinking. And like Kara said, they did all different variations on different kinds of units that have really helped us think about ways to do anti-racist work and culturally sustaining work. So I doubt they'll watch this, but if you do, hi y'all, thank you.
I've been since hearing this groundtruthing concept, I've been thinking of it brings me back to Amilcar Cabral, who's, you know, a revolutionary in Guinea and Cape Verde, and he spent, before he became like the leader, one of the leaders of the movement, he was a agronomist. So he basically, his job was like to walk the land, and it got me to Googling these essays about his relationship between walking the land and his noticing that the time was now for like this revolutionary movement to come into being. So that's where my tabs are right now. And I'm sort of like sitting with those Googles. But thank you all. And I really appreciate you all work and the connection that you made, and poetry too, right?
Andrea, do you want to go? Because I have final thoughts, but I feel like I want you to be able to share before I go.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that like the final thought that I'm left with is that I'm thinking as how important it is for those of us who are more on the research side of things to collaborate with teachers. I'm thinking about, Kara's knowledge of her students and of the community in which this work took place, and her identity also as a researcher is invaluable to this work. And so I'm thinking about how often it is that that perspective is left out of educational research, or it's just nodded to as an aside, but really it's vital. We need it to understand the students and the school context and the city context. And so that's something that I'm continually thinking about, is how to make the teacher perspective, and the administrator perspective and other stakeholders at the school, the parent perspective, how to surface that more and more in research, and how to make sure that that voice is present.
Thanks. So my final thought is really just about kind of something that Becca said and Kara alluded to in relation to kind of professional learning spaces and the importance of anti-racist and also culturally sustaining and just, identity aligned professional learning spaces. And I want to just really acknowledge the National Writing Project and the Marginal Syllabus as one of those writing spaces for me, or one of those professional learning spaces for me, right? And I think that you know, I mean, the NWP's work is really grounded in, right, kind of looking at literacy in powerful ways to kind of question truths, right? And I think particularly through the Marginal Syllabus kind of initiative, right, we've been really pushing the conversations to look at the perspectives that are often left to the side. And I really appreciate the intentionality of that, because, you know, I do good work and have good communities, like lots of places. It's nice to have a home base. With NWP, it's nice to be able to have these conversations and be invited to have conversations with folks that are part of this, this national network. And so I just, you know, I'm really grateful for the authors' willingness to it's hard to put your text out there and be vulnerable. And Kara, especially, it's hard to like open up your classroom and be like, hey, like, this is what we do. Cause you never know once you go public, like what the reaction is going to be. And I mean, you all are doing really, really great work. But I think also being able to engage in the conversation is really important, right? Because that's the way that the work actually impacts the classrooms, which is what we really want to happen with our work. So thanks so much. And thanks to Ramee and Joe and Christina and the National Writing Project for creating this space. Not only like the actual annotation space, but also this webinar space, because this was a really great kind of professional learning way to start my day too.
Well, Bettina, and of course, all you're of course very welcome. You know, it's not the same unless we all come into the sandbox and play together and bring the tools and experiences and identities that we've mentioned to the space. And so, you know, as we do begin to wrap up our webinar today, I just want to thank, and I think I can speak on behalf of, you know, the kind of broad Marginal Syllabus project and family that, you know, thanking Kara and Andrea, Becca and Nate, of course, for being our partner authors as we move into April, and Bettina, you and Chris for being engaged participants in this work, both in webinar spaces, in online annotation spaces. I have 4.5 pages of scrawled written notes from today's conversation. As Chris also is sharing, you know, books and covers, and as you mentioned.
I'm sorry, I couldn't type fast enough. Yep. I want to make sure I got it in.
I love it. Yes, get it in. Yes, get it in.
Yeah, the Indie Chirac, a literary mixtape from Northwestern Press, came out last year. Really great book.
Oh, brilliant. Chris, thank you. And again, thanks to everyone. This is really then an invitation to say this is the beginning of a conversation. We began a conversation here. We look forward to educators of all flavors and stripes and positions who are going to watch and listen to this, and then to bring this work into a continuation of that conversation online through our digital annotation. Again, the text will be available in an open access format starting in April. So again, thanks to everyone.
Yeah, I'll echo Ramee's thanks, and again, just my final thought is that I hope that our online annotation conversation that will happen in the margins of this article is, you know, anywhere near as powerful as this conversation's been, and I just appreciate the voices of the authors and Kara coming through so positively to represent this work. So thank you. I want to thank everyone for joining us here at Connected Learning TV to talk, you know, again for the Marginal Syllabus. Our text once again was, and mine's marked up, it's Cultivating Urban Literacies on Chicago's South Side through a Pedagogy of Spatial Justice. The authors Andrea Vaughan, Rebecca Woodard, Nathan C. Phillips, and Kara Taylor. So thank you again. And this article will appear on Marginal Syllabus on April 1st. This webinar will go live on April 2nd. So now for updates, subscribe to our blog and sign up monthly for the monthly newsletter at educatorinnovator.org. We'd love a follow at @innovates_ed, and please follow the hashtag Marginal Syllabus. Thanks, everyone.